So in this video, I'm going to discuss about the respiratory chain, that is also called electron transport chain, and this occurs inside the mitochondria. So electron transport chain or the respiratory chain, it consists of these 6 numbers of enzyme complexes. So complex 1, complex 2, then ETF ubiquinone oxidoreductase, then number 4 is the glycerol 3-phosphate dehydrogenase, complex 3, complex 4. So now we start discussing. So first of all, we will discuss the transfer of electrons from the NAD or FAD to ubiquinone, that is written as Q. So Q stands for ubiquinone. So here the NAD or FAD, so these two are the electron carriers that brings electrons from different substrates like glucose, fatty acids or amino acids. So NADH, it brings electrons, and this NADH, if you see this is the complex 1. So complex 1 brings the electrons, takes the electrons from the NAD, and NADH gets oxidized to NAD plus, and then the electrons are transferred to complex 1. Then this complex 1 transfers this electron to the ubiquinone. So now the succinate, or this is what is called complex 2. So complex 2 transfers the electrons from FAD to ubiquinone. Then the third enzyme is the glycerol 3-phosphate dehydrogenase. This enzyme transfers electrons from the NADH present in the cytoplasm to ubiquinone. The fourth enzyme is the ETF-Q oxidoreductase. So this particular enzyme, it transfers the electrons from fatty acid coenzyme, or simply we say fatty acids, to the ubiquinone. The first step of electron transport chain is transfer of electrons from electron carriers to ubiquinone. So ubiquinone, it is an insoluble compound present inside the membrane of the mitochondria, that is the inner membrane. So this particular part, it is the membrane, it is the inner membrane. Then the next step of the electron transport chain is transfer of electrons from ubiquinone to cytochrome C, and then to oxygen. So this is the cytochrome, this one is the ubiquinone, and from ubiquinone the electrons are transferred to cytochrome C. So this transfer of electrons from ubiquinone to cytochrome C, it is done by the complex 3. So complex 3 causes oxidation of the ubiquinone and sends the electrons to the cytochrome C. And then we have the fourth complex, that is called complex 4. So complex 4 transfers the electrons from cytochrome C to oxygen, and the oxygen gets reduced to make the water. So this is what we call the metabolic water. Okay, so this is the, as a whole, the reaction. So now this particular electron, that is 4 electrons, are transferred to the oxygen. So they cannot transfer the oxygen to the electrons to the oxygen, but what they do, these 4 electrons are added to the 4 numbers of H positive ions present in the matrix, and then these 4 H positive ions, they react with the 4 electrons, and they form the 4 numbers of hydrogen, and 4 numbers of hydrogen, they react with the oxygen, and then they form the 2 numbers of water molecule. So this is what we call this as a metabolic water. Now, how the electrons are transferred from NADH to oxygen? So here the transfer of electrons is the passive transfer. Okay, so now electrons always gets transferred from low reduction potential to high reduction potential. So that means any substrate having low reduction potential, So the electrons will move from low reduction potential to the substrate having high reduction potential, and then this passage of the electrons from low to high reduction potential, it releases energy, free energy. So any kind of passive transport, they always release energy. If you talk about the active transport and passive transport, so the active transport consumes energy, and the passive transport, it occurs by itself, and the passive transport always releases free energy. So in this case, the electrons, as they move passively from low reduction potential to high reduction potential, there is always a release of the free energy, because this movement is a passive movement. So if we just look into it, yeah. So now when the electrons are transferred from low reduction potential to high reduction potential, so this leads to formation, this leads to development of the free energy, and this free energy is used by the enzymes to actively transport the protons from matrix to intermembrane space. So that means it is a coupled transport. So passive transport of electrons will release energy, and this released energy is used by another system to actively transport the protons from matrix to intermembrane space. So we start from here. So this part is the matrix, and this part is the intermembrane space. So now, as we have discussed earlier, this is the movement of the electrons from NAD to ubiquinone and then to oxygen. So in this case, the oxygen has got highest reduction potential, and subsequently the NAD has got the lowest reduction potential. So, and then if we talk about the movement of electrons from NAD to ubiquinone, so ubiquinone has higher reduction potential than NAD. And then if we go ahead, the cytochrome C has got higher reduction potential than ubiquinone, and that is why from ubiquinone the electrons are transferred to the cytochrome C passively. And then after that, from cytochrome C, the electrons are transferred to the oxygen. So oxygen is having higher reduction potential than cytochrome C. So oxygen having the highest reduction potential, that's why it is the final acceptor of the electron. Now in this process, the electrons are moving from NAD or from FAD to this direction. So this movement is the passive movement, and passive movement always releases energy. So this energy is used by these complexes to push the protons actively from matrix to intermembrane space. So this particular movement of the protons from matrix to intermembrane space, it is a active movement. So from where this active movement of the protons, they are getting the energy. They are getting the energy from the passive movement of the electrons from NAD to ubiquinone. So complex 1, it transfers 4 number of protons for every 2 numbers of electrons it transfers. Now similar way, the complex 3. So complex 3 transfers 4 number of protons for every 2 electrons it transfers. So now, as I have told earlier, that the transfer of electrons from ubiquinone to cytochrome C, it is a passive transport, and this passive transport releases energy, and this energy is used by complex 3 to actively transport 4 number of protons from matrix to intermembrane space. And then the same thing occurs in case of complex 4. So complex 4 transfers electrons passively from cytochrome C to oxygen, and this passive transport, it releases energy. This passive transport will release energy, and this energy will be used by the complex 4 to actively transport 2 numbers of protons to intermembrane space. Now here the point to be remembered is, like, The complex one transfers 4 protons for every 2 electrons it transfers. Then complex 3 also transfers 4 number of protons for every 2 electrons it transfers. But the complex 4 transfers only 2 protons for every 2 electrons it has transferred. So now as a result, as we have already discussed, so why this is active transport? Because the intermembrane space is already having high concentration of H positive ions or protons, and the matrix has got less concentration of H positive ions. So this movement from matrix to intermembrane space, this movement of the protons, it is an active movement. We've already discussed. Okay, so now what happens? This process we have already discussed. So this is the movement of the electrons from NAD to this movement of electrons from NAD to FAD, to NAD to ubiquinone, it is a passive transport, and through this passive transport, energy is used by the same enzyme to actively throw the protons. As a result, what happens? The intermembrane space here, the concentration of protons goes on increasing, and then these protons, they come back. Now these protons from here, these protons are thrown there, and then these protons from intermembrane space will come back to the matrix. Now this coming back of the protons from intermembrane space to the matrix, it is a passive movement. So now what will happen? Because why it is passive movement? Because intermembrane space has got a high concentration of H positive ions, so they will come back through this channel. So this particular channel, it is also called complex 5, or simply it is called ATPase. So when the H positive ions comes back passively to the matrix, so this passive movement of protons will release energy, because we have already discussed that passive movement always releases energy. So this time the protons will return to the matrix passively. So this passive movement of the protons will release energy, and this energy will be used to make the ATP, because ADP plus phosphate, this gives the ATP. So this particular reaction requires energy. This energy comes from the passive entry of the protons from intermembrane space to matrix. So in nutshell, this is what we call oxidative phosphorylation. So here the ADP and phosphate, they combine and then they form the ATP, and for this reaction they require energy. This energy comes from the entry of the protons from intermembrane space to the matrix, that is the passive entry of protons from intermembrane space to the matrix, which releases energy, and this energy is used to make the ATP. This is what we call oxidative phosphorylation. So what is that? So phosphorylation means the addition of the phosphate, that is called phosphorylation. So in this case, the phosphate is added to the ADP to make ATP, and we use the word oxidative phosphorylation. Oxidative means because this phosphorylation is linked to oxidation, because here the NADH or FADH2, they are oxidized, and oxidized means the electrons are taken away from them and is added to the oxygen. So this phosphorylation depends upon the oxidation reaction of the respiratory chain. So here we have two pathways. One is this pathway, that is the electron transport chain, and second one is the oxidative phosphorylation. These two pathways are coupled pathway. So if the oxygen is not there, so in that case this transfer will stop. If the electron transfer from NAD or FADH2 to oxygen stops, then as a result what will happen? The protons in the intermembrane space will be less, and then there won't be any entry of the protons to the matrix and there won't be ATP formation. On the other hand, if we block the oxidative phosphorylation, the electron transport chain will also get blocked. That means these two pathways, they are coupled pathway. If you stop one pathway, other pathway itself will get stopped. So now this is what I am showing here. So this is the passive entry of the protons from intermembrane space to the matrix. Energy is released to make the ATP. So now as a whole, 4 numbers of protons are required to enter the matrix to make 1 ATP. So in the next video, we will discuss that how 4 numbers of protons are required to make 1 ATP, because through ATPase only 3 protons enter to make 1 ATP. What is the role of the 4th proton? We will discuss in the next video. Thank you very much for watching this video. See you in the next video.